Courtroom 302 was silent. Not the ordinary kind of silence that settled over a room while people waited for proceedings to begin. This was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made defense attorneys straighten their ties and prosecutors double-check their notes. At exactly 9 a.m., the side door opened. Judge Rosalyn Haze entered without looking at anyone. The bailiff immediately stood. All rise. Every person in the courtroom rose to their feet. Haze crossed the room with measured steps and took her seat behind the elevated bench. Her black robe hung perfectly over her shoulders. Her expression never changed. She wasn't famous because she was harsh. She was famous because she was impossible to manipulate. For nearly 15 years, attorneys, detectives, politicians, and even fellow judges had learned the same lesson. Rosalyn Haze did not care about titles, reputations, or excuses. She cared about facts. And if the facts embarrassed someone important, that was their problem. Be seated. The room obeyed. Haze opened the case file in front of her. State versus Dion Carter. A young man seated at the defense table swallowed hard. Dion Carter was 19 years old, a second-year engineering student. No prior arrests, no criminal record, no gang affiliations, no disciplinary history. Until 3 weeks ago. Now he was facing felony drug possession charges that could destroy his future before it even started. Dion's hands trembled slightly beneath the table. His mother sat in the gallery behind him. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Across the room sat Officer Mitchell Granger. Unlike Dion, Granger looked completely relaxed. He had spent nearly 16 years in the narcotics division. His reputation among younger officers bordered on legendary. Hundreds of arrests, major drug seizures, commendations, task force assignments. He carried himself like a man who had testified so many times he no longer considered it stressful. When his name was called, he approached the witness stand with casual confidence. The prosecutor smiled. That alone told Leonard Croft everything he needed to know. Croft adjusted his glasses. The public defender had handled enough cases to recognize when the state believed it had already won, and today they clearly did. The prosecutor stood. Officer Granger, please tell the court how you came into contact with the defendant. Granger folded his hands. On the evening of May 12th, I observed a black Honda Accord traveling eastbound on Harrison Avenue. He spoke calmly, confidently, without hesitation. The vehicle had a broken right tail light. I initiated a traffic stop. The prosecutor nodded. And what happened next? I approached the vehicle and immediately detected the odor of marijuana. Dion closed his eyes. He had heard this story before. Twice. Once in the police report. Once during preliminary hearings. The prosecutor continued. What did you do then? I requested identification. Granger leaned slightly forward. The driver appeared nervous. Dion's attorney almost laughed. Nervous? A teenager being stopped by a narcotics detective at night? Of course he was nervous. But Granger said it like nervousness itself was evidence. I asked him to exit the vehicle. And I conducted a search. The prosecutor paused dramatically. What did you find? A plastic bag containing cocaine. The courtroom remained silent. The prosecutor turned toward the judge. No further questions. Everything looked devastating. Broken taillight, probable cause, drug discovery, open and shut. Exactly the way Granger wanted it. Judge Haze looked toward the defense. Mr. Croft? The attorney stood slowly. He carried a thin folder in one hand. Nothing about his posture suggested panic. In fact, he looked almost amused. Good morning, Officer Granger. Granger nodded. Counselor, Croft approached the witness stand. You testified that Mr. Carter's right tail light was broken. Correct. You are certain? Yes. No doubt whatsoever? None. Croft glanced toward the jury box out of habit before remembering this was a bench proceeding. Then he looked back at Granger. You observed this from how far away? Approximately 50 feet. And it was dark outside? Yes. But you were still able to determine the taillight was non-functional. Correct. Croft nodded, then smiled. A small smile, the kind lawyers wore when they already knew the answer. Judge Haze noticed. So did Granger. The officer's confidence faded slightly. Officer, are you familiar with Defense Exhibit D? The prosecutor frowned. Granger hesitated. No. Interesting. Croft turned. Your Honor, defense requests permission to publish Exhibit D. The prosecutor immediately stood. Objection. Haze looked up. On what grounds? We haven't established relevance. Croft didn't even bother responding. He simply handed a flash drive to the bailiff. Judge Haze reviewed the filing, then looked toward the prosecution. Overruled. The prosecutor sat back down. A television monitor mounted beside the bench flickered to life. The room watched. The video began. A timestamp appeared in the corner. May 12th, 10:14 p.m. The grainy image showed Harrison Avenue. Cars passed through the intersection. Then a black Honda Accord entered the frame. Dion's car. Croft said nothing. He simply allowed the footage to play. The vehicle moved closer, 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 then stopped at a red light. Every eye in the courtroom focused on the rear of the car. The taillights glowed bright red, both of them, including the right one, perfectly functional. The room went silent, a different silence this time. The prosecutor blinked, once, then twice. Officer Granger stared at the screen. Croft let the footage continue. The Honda accelerated through the intersection. The right tail light remained illuminated. No flickering, no damage, no malfunction. Nothing. The video ended. Nobody spoke. Judge Haze slowly lowered her glasses. Her eyes moved toward Granger. Officer? For the first time all morning, Granger looked uncomfortable. Croft stepped closer. Would you like to revise your testimony? No. The answer came too quickly. Croft raised an eyebrow. No? No. The officer swallowed. The footage may not show the issue. Croft nearly laughed. May not show the issue? Correct. Croft looked toward the screen. Officer, the camera appears capable of showing both taillights. No answer. It also appears capable of showing the right taillight functioning normally. Still no answer. The prosecutor looked increasingly nervous. Croft continued. You based your stop on a traffic violation that appears not to have existed. I disagree. Croft opened another document. Interesting. He paused, then delivered the blow. Would you care to explain why dispatch records show that you requested permission to search the vehicle only 2 minutes after initiating the stop? Granger froze. The courtroom noticed. Croft pressed forward. 2 minutes, officer. No answer. You had not identified the driver. Silence. You had not run his license. Silence. You had not issued a warning. Silence. So how exactly did you determine probable cause in under 2 minutes? The officer shifted in his seat. For the first time, he looked trapped. Judge Haze watched every second, every hesitation, every evasive glance, every nervous movement. The courtroom could feel the case collapsing, brick by brick, sentence by sentence. The prosecutor attempted to object. Haze raised a hand, without looking at him. The objection died immediately. Croft wasn't finished. Officer Granger, have you ever testified falsely under oath? The prosecutor jumped up. Objection! Sustained. Croft nodded. Withdrawn. He closed the folder. then looked directly at the witness. No further questions. The damage was done. Granger stepped down from the stand, but his confidence never returned. Judge Haze reviewed her notes. The courtroom waited. 30 seconds passed, then 60. Nobody moved. Finally, Haze looked up. Her expression was colder than before, much colder. "Officer Granger." The detective stopped. Haze stared directly at him. "I have served on this bench for nearly 15 years. The room became perfectly still. I have heard testimony from murderers, gang leaders, federal agents, elected officials, and law enforcement officers. Nobody dared interrupt. But rarely have I encountered testimony as deeply troubling as what I heard today." Granger's face drained of color. Haze continued, "The dash camera footage directly contradicts your stated reason for initiating this stop." Every word landed like a hammer. "The court finds your explanation wholly unsupported by the evidence." The prosecutor lowered his head. Dion looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. Haze turned toward him. "Mr. Carter." Dion immediately stood. "The evidence obtained during this traffic stop is suppressed." His eyes widened. "Furthermore," Haze closed the case file, "this matter is dismissed in its entirety." Dion's mother burst into tears. A gasp spread through the gallery. The young student nearly collapsed into his chair. It was over. Just like that. The nightmare was over. But Judge Haze wasn't finished, not even close. She looked back toward Granger, and the entire atmosphere changed. "Officer Granger, what concerns this court is not merely the unlawful stop." The detective remained frozen. "What concerns this court is the possibility that false testimony was knowingly provided under oath." The room exploded into whispers. Haze struck her gavel once. Silence returned. "I am ordering the complete transcript of today's proceedings forwarded to Internal Affairs." The whispers returned, louder. "Additionally, I am forwarding the matter to the District Attorney's Office with a formal recommendation that potential perjury charges be reviewed." The prosecutor looked horrified. Granger looked like he'd been shot. His career wasn't merely damaged, it was hanging over a cliff, and everyone in the room knew it. Judge Haze stood. "This court is adjourned." The gavel struck. Once. Sharp. Final. People immediately began talking. Reporters rushed toward the hallway. Attorneys exchanged stunned looks. Dion embraced his mother. But across the room, Mitchell Granger never moved. He stood alone, watching the bench, watching the empty chair where Rosalyn Haze had been sitting moments earlier. His jaw tightened. The humiliation burned through him. 16 years, hundreds of arrests, a reputation built over a lifetime, destroyed in less than an hour. By one judge, one woman, one courtroom, one video. The crowd slowly disappeared. Still, he stood there, breathing harder, anger replacing shock, then resentment replacing anger, and finally something much worse. Hatred. Pure hatred. Because in Granger's mind, this was no longer about evidence. It was no longer about Dion Carter. It was no longer even about perjury. It was about Rosalyn Haze. And as he finally turned toward the exit, one thought repeated itself over and over inside his head. She thinks she won. She thinks this is over. But before long, Judge Rosalyn Haze was going to learn exactly what happened to people who humiliated Mitchell Granger in public. Mitchell Granger didn't go home after court. He drove aimlessly through the city for nearly 2 hours. The dismissal kept replaying in his head, the footage, the whispers, the looks from other officers, the judge's voice. Wholly unsupported by the evidence, potential perjury charges. 16 years. Gone. Not officially. Not yet. But Granger knew how these things worked. Internal affairs would start digging. Old cases would be reopened. Defense attorneys would smell blood. Every arrest he had ever made would suddenly become suspicious. One judge had managed to do what criminals, gang leaders, and defense lawyers had failed to do for over a decade. She had made him vulnerable. By sunset, his anger had transformed into obsession. By midnight, it became a plan. A dangerous one. Because the more Granger thought about Rosalyn Haze, the more he realized something. Judges were powerful, respected, protected. But they had one weakness: their reputations. A detective accused of misconduct might survive. A politician caught lying might recover. A judge accused of criminal activity? Finished. Immediately. And unlike violence, unlike threats, unlike harassment, a destroyed reputation left no fingerprints. By 2 a.m., Granger knew exactly what he was going to do. He wasn't going to hurt Judge Haze. He was going to erase her. Professionally. Completely. And he intended to do it using the same weapon she had used against him. Evidence. Or at least what looked like evidence. 3 days later, Granger parked outside a rundown auto repair shop on the south side of the city. The building appeared abandoned. Half the windows were boarded. The sign was faded beyond recognition. To most people, it looked worthless. To Granger, it was a meeting place. He checked his surroundings, then stepped inside. The smell of oil and rust filled the air. A heavy metal door opened at the back. A bald man emerged, mid-40s, tattooed neck, broken nose, cold eyes. His name was Hector Ruiz. Officially, he didn't exist in any investigation. Unofficially, nearly every narcotics detective in the city knew exactly who he was. Hector supplied information, sometimes drugs, sometimes both, and he always knew who was willing to pay. "You look stressed," Hector said. Granger didn't smile. "I need something." "What kind of something?" "Enough to ruin somebody." That got Hector's attention. The man folded his arms. "That's expensive." Granger reached into his jacket and handed him an envelope. Hector opened it. His eyebrows rose slightly. "There it is." "Can you get it?" Hector looked at the cash again, then nodded. "Yeah." "What quantity?" 3 ounces. Hector whistled. "You're not playing around." "No." The room grew quiet. Finally, Hector asked the question, "Who's the target?" Granger stared at him. "Doesn't matter." Hector understood immediately. He stopped asking questions. 48 hours later, Granger received a text message from a burner phone. One line. Ready. Nothing else. No names, no location, no details. Standard procedure. That evening, he collected the package. Vacuum sealed, triple wrapped. White powder. Laboratory-grade narcotics. Enough to trigger federal charges. Enough to destroy a career. Enough to send someone to prison. Granger stared at it for several seconds, then locked it inside a metal case. The point of no return had arrived, and instead of fear, he felt relief. For the next week, Granger became a student, not of law enforcement, of security. Every day he observed the courthouse, every entrance, every camera, every guard rotation, every maintenance worker, every blind spot. He studied floor plans, employee schedules, access routes, emergency exits. The preparation became almost military, because if there was one thing Granger understood, it was investigations. And the only way to beat an investigation was to think like the people conducting it. What he eventually discovered surprised him. The courthouse wasn't nearly as secure as people believed. Most security measures focused on public areas, courtrooms, hallways, entrances. The assumption was simple. Nobody would be stupid enough to target a judge. That assumption would soon become a problem. One afternoon, Granger visited a storage locker he hadn't opened in years. Inside were old uniforms, equipment, retired case files, and something else. An obsolete courthouse maintenance access card. Technically inactive. Technically. But older systems sometimes retain permissions by accident. The card had never been audited, never deactivated, never recovered. Granger looked at it, then smiled. For the first time in days. Friday night, 8:47 p.m. The courthouse was nearly empty. Most judges had gone home hours earlier. Administrative staff were gone. The public was long gone. Only a skeleton crew remained. Perfect. Granger parked 3 blocks away. Dark clothing, gloves, baseball cap. No police vehicle, no personal phone, no identifiable equipment. Every detail mattered. He crossed the street calmly. No rushing, no nervous movements, no behavior that would attract attention. At the side entrance, he removed the old access card. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then, beep, the lock disengaged. Granger felt a surge of satisfaction. He stepped inside. The building swallowed him. The hallways were quiet, almost eerie. Motion sensors activated lights as he moved. Pools of brightness appeared ahead of him and vanished behind him. Every footstep echoed. He knew exactly where he was going. 3rd floor, East Wing, judicial offices. A section of the courthouse most people never entered. According to official records, Judge Haze had already left for the weekend. Her chambers should be empty. The elevator doors opened. Granger stepped out. The corridor stretched before him, silent, still. He checked both directions. Nobody. His pulse remained steady. Years of narcotics work had taught him how to move under pressure. 30 seconds later, he stood outside her office. The gold nameplate reflected the overhead lights. Judge Rosalyn Haze. For a moment, he simply stared at it. The anger returned immediately. The courtroom, the humiliation, the whispers, everything came flooding back. Slowly, he opened the door. The chambers were larger than he expected. Dark wood, bookshelves, diplomas, awards. Everything neat, everything organized, everything exactly the way someone like Hayes would keep it. Granger entered carefully, closing the door behind him. The room was silent. His flashlight swept across the desk. Legal documents, case files, family photographs, nothing useful. He moved deeper into the office, searching, looking for something personal, something undeniable, something investigators would immediately connect to her. Then he saw it, a leather briefcase, expensive, professional, resting inside a desk compartment. His breathing slowed. Perfect. He opened the compartment, removed the briefcase, set it on the desk, unlocked the metal case he had carried inside, then carefully removed the package. 3 ounces, vacuum sealed, federal quantity, career-ending quantity. The white powder looked harmless, almost innocent, which made it even more dangerous. Granger unzipped the briefcase, placed the package inside, deep beneath several folders, far enough to guarantee discovery, close enough to appear intentional. Then he closed everything exactly as he found it. No fingerprints, no visible disturbance, no mistakes. At least none that he could see. He took one final look around the office, then left, certain he had just committed the perfect crime. What Granger didn't know What he couldn't possibly know was that directly above Judge Hayes's desk sat a smoke detector that wasn't entirely a smoke detector. And at that exact moment, a silent camera was recording everything in crystal clear 4K resolution. By Saturday morning, Phase 2 began. The accusation. Because evidence meant nothing if nobody found it. At 10:16 a.m., a burner phone activated for the first time. The call lasted 23 seconds. The voice was computer-generated, genderless, emotionless, impossible to trace. The DEA Task Force tip line received the message. Judge Rosalyn Haze is storing narcotics inside her courthouse chambers and distributing controlled substances through intermediaries. Search her office immediately. Click. The call ended. 4 minutes later, another call. This one went directly to Captain David Miller, head of Internal Affairs, a man known for taking corruption allegations seriously. The automated voice repeated the accusation, then disconnected. No explanation, no demands, no threats, just information. Exactly the type of anonymous tip investigators often couldn't ignore. By noon, wheels were already turning. Requests were being drafted. Phones were ringing. Federal contacts were being notified. And somewhere across the city, Mitchell Granger sat alone in his apartment, watching the news, waiting, smiling. Because for the first time since Courtroom 302, he felt something close to victory. He imagined the headlines, the scandal, the arrest, the destruction of Rosalyn Haze's reputation. He imagined her face when they found the drugs. He imagined the cameras, the reporters, the handcuffs. And he had absolutely no idea that less than 48 hours from now, his entire world was about to collapse. Monday morning arrived faster than Mitchell Granger expected. By 8:15 a.m., the courthouse parking garage was already filling with judges, attorneys, clerks, and law enforcement personnel preparing for another week of hearings. Judge Rosalyn Haze arrived exactly on schedule, as always. She carried the same leather briefcase, the same one sitting in her chambers, the same one that now contained enough narcotics to destroy everything she had built over the course of her career. And she had absolutely no idea, or so Granger believed. From an unmarked sedan parked half a block away, he watched courthouse employees move through the entrance, waiting, patiently. Sooner or later, the anonymous tip would trigger action. Sooner or later, someone would come for her. At 9:42 a.m., his burner phone vibrated. A single message. Search warrant approved. Granger smiled. The trap had sprung. At 10:17 a.m., Judge Haze was reviewing motions when someone knocked sharply on her office door. Enter. The door opened. 3 people stepped inside. Captain David Miller, 2 Internal Affairs detectives, and directly behind them, Mitchell Granger. Haze immediately noticed him. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Miller looked uncomfortable. Judge Haze? She set down her pen. Captain. The room felt suddenly smaller. Miller cleared his throat. We have a court-authorized search warrant. The words hung in the air. For the first time, one of the detectives looked embarrassed. Haze remained perfectly calm. A search warrant for what? Miller hesitated, then answered, narcotics. Silence. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Haze leaned back in her chair. Narcotics. Yes, Your Honor. The title sounded strange coming from Miller now. The detectives exchanged glances. Even Granger could feel the tension. But beneath it all, excitement surged through him. This was it. The moment. The fall. The humiliation. Everything he had imagined. Haze folded her hands. Proceed. No anger. No panic. No outrage. That caught Granger off guard. Most people would be screaming by now, demanding lawyers, threatening lawsuits. Not Rosalyn Haze. She simply watched. The search began. Desk drawers, cabinets, shelves, boxes. Every compartment was opened, every document examined. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then 10 minutes. Still nothing. Granger felt the first flicker of concern. The drugs were there. He knew they were there. He had placed them himself. Then one detective approached the desk. The briefcase. Granger's pulse jumped. The detective removed it carefully, placed it on the desk, opened it, looked inside, then froze. The room became completely silent. Slowly, the detective reached deeper into the case and pulled out a large, vacuum-sealed package of white powder. Nobody said a word, not even Granger. The sight was dramatic, impossible to ignore. The package looked enormous under the office lights. Detective Cross stared at it, then looked toward Captain Miller. "It's here." The words landed like a bomb. Another detective immediately performed a field test. Everyone watched. Seconds passed. The chemical indicator changed color. Positive. The detective exhaled slowly. Cocaine. Granger almost smiled. Almost. Everything had worked. Every detail. Every step. Every risk. Judge Rosalyn Haze was finished. Captain Miller looked physically sick. Not angry, not triumphant. Sick. Because the person sitting in front of him wasn't a criminal. She was a judge he had respected for years. And now narcotics had been found in her office. Federal quantity narcotics. The implications were catastrophic. Miller took a deep breath, then spoke. "Judge Haze." He struggled to finish the sentence. Haze helped him. "You're placing me under arrest." The room remained silent. Miller nodded. At this moment, yes. One detective stepped forward with handcuffs. Granger felt his heart pounding. This was the image he had imagined, the moment that would destroy her. But instead of standing, instead of arguing, instead of protesting, Rosalyn Haze looked directly at Captain Miller and asked a single question. "Do you trust me?" The room froze. Miller frowned. "What? Do you trust me?" Nobody understood where this was going, not even Granger. Finally, Miller answered, "Yes." Haze nodded. "Then call Philip Norton." "Who?" "Our IT director." Silence. "And ask him to pull the footage from the smoke detector above my desk." For the first time that morning, Mitchell Granger felt fear. Real fear. Cold fear. The kind that starts in your stomach and climbs into your chest. Because suddenly, a memory surfaced. The smoke detector. He remembered seeing it. He remembered noticing it. But he had never looked twice. Why would he? It was a smoke detector, wasn't it? Haze continued. "Call him." Nobody moved. Then Captain Miller looked up. The detector sat directly above the desk. Ordinary. Harmless. Invisible. Except now it didn't seem harmless at all. 23 minutes later, Philip Norton arrived carrying a laptop. He looked confused and nervous. Very nervous. Nobody had explained much, only that Judge Haze needed security footage immediately. Norton connected the laptop to a monitor. The room gathered around. Miller, the detectives, Haze, Granger, everyone. The IT director typed several commands. A secure archive appeared, then another, then another. Finally, he located the camera feed. Found it. The room went silent. Norton pressed play. The footage appeared in stunning 4K resolution, crystal clear. No grain, no blur, no ambiguity. The empty office appeared on screen. Timestamp visible. Date visible. Everything visible. Then the door opened. A man entered, wearing dark clothing, baseball cap, gloves. The room watched closely. The figure moved toward the desk, opened a compartment, removed a briefcase, then placed something inside. Nobody breathed. The figure leaned forward, and for a brief second, his face became fully visible. Every detail, every feature, every line. The footage paused automatically as facial recognition software enhanced the image. The screen sharpened. The face filled the monitor. Mitchell Granger. The room exploded. What the hell? My God. Jesus Christ. One detective physically stepped backward. Captain Miller stared at the screen in disbelief. Then something else caught his attention. The watch. A custom silver dive watch. Distinctive. Engraved. Impossible to mistake. Granger wore it almost every day. The same watch sat on his wrist right now. The detective beside Miller slowly turned toward him. Horror spread across the room. Nobody was looking at the screen anymore. They were looking at Granger. The detective holding the evidence bag suddenly understood. The anonymous tip, the warrant, the drugs, the timing, everything. Every piece fit together, and every piece pointed to one man, Mitchell Granger. Captain Miller looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. The betrayal hit harder than the crime. Because Granger wasn't just another officer. He had worked under him for years, shared investigations, shared cases, shared trust. Now that trust lay shattered across the room. Miller spoke quietly, almost sadly. Mitchell. Granger said nothing. Tell me this isn't real. Silence. Tell me. Still silence, because there was nothing left to say. The video had destroyed him, the same way the dashcam footage had destroyed him in Courtroom 302. Only this time, the consequences would be much worse. Captain Miller turned slowly. Detective Cross. Cross already understood. His hand moved toward his cuffs. Read him his rights. Granger's world collapsed. Right there. Inside the office, he had entered believing he controlled everything. The detective stepped forward. Mitchell Granger, you are under arrest. Nobody stopped him. Nobody defended him. Nobody even looked surprised anymore. The evidence was overwhelming. Breaking and entering, evidence tampering, perjury, false reporting, possession of narcotics, conspiracy. The list kept growing, each charge heavier than the last. Cross secured the handcuffs. The metal clicked shut. Final, cold, unavoidable. Granger stared at Judge Haze. She stared back. No smile, no celebration, no revenge, only disappointment. Somehow, that hurt more. News spread through the courthouse in minutes. By the time detectives escorted Granger into the hallway, people were already gathering. Clerks, lawyers, bailiffs, secretaries, police officers. Everyone had heard something. Nobody knew the full story, but they knew enough. The crowd parted as Granger walked past, handcuffed, head lowered, disgraced. The same courthouse where he had testified hundreds of times. The same courthouse where people once respected him. Now, every pair of eyes followed him, not with admiration, but with disbelief and shame. The investigation that followed became one of the largest corruption probes in city history. Under questioning, Granger broke. At first, he denied everything. Then he admitted the break-in. Then the drugs. Then the anonymous calls. And finally, everything else. Old cases, fabricated reports, illegal searches, questionable informants. The floodgates opened. Detectives began tracing phone records, financial records, burner phones, confidential informants, search warrants, arrest reports. What they found shocked everyone. The corruption extended far beyond one man. Several officers became targets of investigation. Dozens of convictions were reviewed. 42 convictions were eventually overturned. People who had spent years in prison walked free, and every discovery made Granger's future darker. 9 months later, Courtroom 407 was packed, not with reporters covering a judge, but with reporters covering a fallen detective. Mitchell Granger sat at the defense table, federal prisoner, convicted felon, former officer. Across the room, Assistant United States Attorney Beatrice Wallace outlined the damage, the lies, the planted evidence, the ruined lives, the corruption, the betrayal of public trust. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Thomas Whitmore adjusted his glasses, then looked directly at Granger. "You were entrusted with enforcing the law." The former detective stared at the floor. "Instead, you chose to weaponize it." Whitmore paused. "You attempted to destroy an innocent judge." Another pause. "You corrupted investigations." Another. "And you damaged public faith in the justice system itself." The judge raised the sentencing order. "This court sentences you to 240 months in federal custody. 20 years. The gavel came down, one sharp crack. Mitchell Granger closed his eyes. His future disappeared with that sound. Several weeks later, Judge Rosalyn Haze returned to her chambers. The office looked exactly as it always had, quiet, orderly, professional, as if none of it had happened. She placed a file on her desk, sat down, then looked upward at the smoke detector. The tiny device nobody noticed, the silent witness that had recorded the truth. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Then she smiled faintly. Not because she had won, not because Granger had lost, but because the system had worked. Barely. Imperfectly, messily, but it had worked. She reached for her black robe, put it on, and prepared for another day on the bench. Outside, court was already coming to order. Inside a federal prison hundreds of miles away, a steel door closed behind Mitchell Granger. And this time, there were no hidden cameras left to save him. The end.